4 units here. Let's look at the division in greater detail. Look at this. A slumber did my spirit seal. She seemed a thing that could not feel. So these smaller units are called feet. The main foot, which seems to be recurrent throughout the poem, is of the type unstressed stressed syllable, right? Like a slum is one type of feet. So these are very important notions in analysis of poem, and the analysis of meter and rhyme in a poem is called prosody. Rhyme and meters are often used to create music and a mood of the poem. It's a convention, it's a tradition, and a device that poets often use, and the study of poetic meters is called prosody. The use of rhyme and meter is one of the ways by which the language of poetry differs from the language of prose. This is one of the major distinctions between the language of poetry and language of prose. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind most of the traditional poetry is in rhyme and meter, and most of the modern poetry seems to be avoiding this kind of fixed patterning of syllables and rhymes. So it follows what is known as free verse. The poem is an elegy or a literary form that conventionally mourns or laments the death of someone close to the speaker. There are many sub-forms or sub-genres of poetry, like the epic, a huge poem, a huge story with many sub-stories in it, like the Mahabharata, the Iliad, Odyssey, the Ramayana, the sonnet, the ballad, the dramatic monologue, and so on. So these are various sub-genres of poetry. So what we have seen till now is the metrical and rhyme patterning that goes on in poetry, and this kind of patterning and rhyming constitutes what is called verse, V-E-R-S-E, verse. It's very important to keep in mind that all verse is not poetry and all poetry is not in verse. Let's look at some other ways in which a poem dances. The other ways in which poem dances, or the ways in which the language of poetry differs from ordinary day-to-day language, comprise of the complex and extensive use of figurative language or figures of speech. A figure of speech is a rhetorical device that achieves a special effect by using words in a distinctive way. When I use word special effects, you have to keep in mind that something like special effect that goes on in films, you find special effects in science fiction films, you find special effects in non-science fiction films also. So a poet uses this special effects in poetry. So what are these special effects? I'm not going to list all of them because the list is too long. I'm going to look at some of the very important figures of speech in our discussion today. If you look at the first line of the poem, the sound S, is repeated, slumber, spirit, seal. And this repetition of consonant sound is a figure of speech called alliteration. R sound in the second last line, rolled round in earth's diurnal course, is another example of alliteration. Alliteration is when you repeat the same syllable over and over again in a poem. It's a figure of speech. But if you look at this figure of speech, this is figure of speech where sound is used in a particular way. And in ancient Sanskrit aesthetics, this kind of figures of speech of sounds were called Shabdalankar. Let's look at very important figure of speech. One of the most important figures of speech in poetry is metaphor. Metaphor is comparison between two different contexts and things without use of comparing words like or as, and this kind of comparison, this kind of analogy is called metaphor. When the comparison which uses words like and as, the direct kind of comparison is called a simile. So simile and metaphor are very common figures of speech. The first line of the poem, there is a comparison between the speaker's ignorance of his beloved's mortal nature and sleep or slumber which sealed the speaker's spirit. So sleep is metaphorical. It's not real sleep that he is talking about, but he is comparing his ignorance. The speaker is comparing his ignorance or lack of knowing with sleep. So this comparison, implicit comparison, is called metaphor. It's one of the most important figures of speech in a poem. So we have seen alliteration, we have seen metaphor, simile. Now let's look at the next figure of speech. The last line of the first and the touch of earthly years is yet another metaphors in this poem. Very important figure of speech is image and what is known as imagery. Image is a verbal representation of a sensory experience, the experience of sight, smell, touch, or taste. This experience is represented verbally in words, or of an object that can be known by one or more senses like sight, smell, touch, and taste. This representation is called an image. Imagery is vivid descriptive language that appeals to one or more than one senses. Let's look at some of the images in the poem. The description of speaker's dead beloved as being rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees is an example of imagery. Imagery gives rise to pictures in our mind, the visuals that we get as if we are watching a film inside our mind when we read a poem, or as if we are watching a television program in our mind, or while we read a novel. This is called imagery. Imagery can be not just visual, but also it might be olfactory, related to smell, tactile, related to touch, and it can be also be related to taste. So poetry consists of very vivid imagery. The visual picture in our mind of earth revolving around the sun, and consequently the body and soul of the speaker's beloved revolving around rocks, stones, and trees, suggests her as becoming one with nature after her death, unlike the poet. The next figure of speech, after alliteration, metaphor, simile, and imagery, the next figure of speech that we are going to look at, very important one, is what is understood as irony. The speaker's description of his beloved as having no motion or force, and she is revolving with earth around the sun, actually implies she is dead, and speaker cannot be one with her. This is also because the speaker, unlike his beloved, was always alienated from nature. This mismatch between what is said and what is meant is an example of irony. In irony, there is a great mismatch between what is said and what is meant. One of very common forms of irony is sarcasm. So when you go back home to your parents with your report card and you have scored 35% and your father say, "What excellent result," it's sarcasm. It's a form of irony. The speaker's opinion that it was because of the slumber which sealed his spirit that he felt that his beloved was untouched by earthly things like mortality is ironic, because it's not really the slumber but his desire that his beloved should not be touched by death, as he loves her deeply, that has made him blind to the fact that she is also human being, and in spite of the fact that he loves her, she is also prone to death like all of us. So this is irony here. There is a mismatch between what is said and what is meant. In fact, it can even be opposite at time. Let's look at the next very important figure of speech, and that is a symbol. So in the beginning we started with what is a poem made of. When we said one of the etymological definitions of poetry is that it is made, it is constructed. Then what is it made up of? It's made up of figures of speech. It's made up of conventions of rhyme and rhythm and syllable and patterning. Right? So these are the elements of a poem. Symbol is very important, one of the most important element of poetry. What is a symbol? Symbol is an image which suggests or represents something other than itself. It's a symbol always points to something else. Think of Tiranga, the tricolored flag, and it symbolizes the nation. Think of white dove, and it symbolizes peace. Think of so many other things and they are symbolic. So symbol is something which points to something else. It represents, it stands for something else, and that is what symbol is. Let's look at the definition closely. In poetry, a symbol represents both what it is and additionally a concept or an idea. Symbol is a thing as well as a concept that is attached to it. The symbol of a white dove suggests peace, and a cow in Indian culture symbolizes maternity, fertility, auspiciousness, and divinity. If you think deeply, then the whole of our culture and language is nothing but a web of symbols. The words that we use in day-to-day life are actually symbolic. So when I say word tree, then the word tree stands for the actual tree. So it stands for. So the words are symbolic. So culture and language is essentially a network of symbol. This is a very important fact to be kept in mind when we look at poetry. And let's look at poetic symbols in the poem. Let's look at what symbols are there in the poem. Slumber, for instance, stands for the lack of knowing on the part of the speaker. It's a symbol. Slumber is a kind of sleep. So we look at this poem and we look at some of the most important components of this poem, and we found that it is full of these commonly found elements in poetry, like rhythm, like meter, like symbol, like irony, like imagery, like use of metaphors and similes. So you can see this is what the poem that we are looking at is made up of. Now I want you to have a look at another poem, lesser known but very fascinating, and I want you to read this poem. Let's look at the next poem here. This poem is called Eating Poetry by a very famous American poet, Mark Strand. Let's read this poem. Ink runs from the corners of my mouth. There is no happiness like mine. I have been eating poetry. The librarian doesn't believe what she sees. Her eyes are sad and she walks with her hand in her dress. The poems are gone. The light is dim. The dogs on the basement stairs are coming up. Their eyeballs roll. Their blonde legs burn like brush. The poor librarian begins to stamp her feet and weep. She does not understand. When I get on my knees and lick her hand, she screams. I am a new man. I snarl at her and bark. I romp with joy in the bookish dark. You can see that this is a very recent poem and a very interesting one, where the speaker is actually talking about his experience of eating poetry. So you can see that this poem is basically metaphorical one, where the act of reading or relishing or enjoying poetry is compared to the act of eating or relishing something like food. So there is an analogy, implicit comparison here. So this is basically a metaphorical poem, and metaphor is one of the most important figures of speech here. Let's look at some other important figures of speech in the poem. If you look at this poem, then there is no such division of stanza like the earlier one. Instead, you have very uneven stanzas. It's not regular 4-line stanzas as the earlier poem. If you look at the lines of this poem, then they are of unequal length, which suggests that there is no fixed metrical pattern in this poem. There is no rhyme. There is no rhyme scheme in this poem. So a poem without a fixed meter or rhyme is called free verse poem, or open form as it is called, and this is a very important form in contemporary poetry. Most of the poetry written in 20th century is free verse or open form poetry. The language of this poem is not fixed rhythmical sing-song fashion language, but the language that we use in our day-to-day life. The rhythms of this poem are actually colloquial day-to-day rhythms of language. The language which the poet seems to be using is the language of day-to-day life, And this is a major difference between traditional poetry and modern poetry. Traditional poetry use a certain kind of artificial language, while modern poetry tries to come closer to day-to-day life language. That's a very important distinction to be kept in mind. Let's look at the images in the poem. The images of ink running from the corners of my mouth. The speaker has eaten poems and the ink is coming down from the corner of his mouth. Is a very striking image. Look at the image of the dogs with blonde legs burning like brush. These images are very striking for their visual appeal. When we read this line, immediately the picture of somebody eating poetry and the ink dripping from corner of his mouth comes to our mind. When he speaks of the dogs with blonde legs, then we immediately see the dogs in our mind with their blonde legs. So this visual imagery is very striking. The speaker also talks of the librarian who is horrified at the idea of eating poetry and the sinister transformative power it has on the reader who is the speaker. What happens towards the end of the poem, if you look at the poem once again, then toward the last stanza, what does the speaker in the poem say? She does not understand. When I get on my knees and lick her hand. The speaker has started licking her hands like a dog. She screams, I am a new man, the speaker says. I snarl at her and bark. I romp with joy in the bookish dark. The speaker has started off as a human, and when he ate those poems, what has happened is that he is transformed into a dog. This transformation is metamorphosis, technically known as metamorphosis. The experience of reading and relishing poetry transforms the reader into something almost non-human like dog, into which the speaker is transformed by the end of the poem. The irony of the poem emerges when the speaker